Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. We have wanted Dan Brown to be on this program for a very long time, so we are thrilled that he is with us this week. He is the author of numerous #1 best-selling novels, including, of course, The Da Vinci Code, which has become one of the most best-selling novels of all time, as well as the subject of intellectual debate among readers and scholars. Brown's novels are published in 56 languages around the world. Last count, 250 million copies in print. The son of a mathematics teacher and a church organist, he was raised on a prep school campus where he developed a fascination with the interplay between science and religion. These are themes that certainly form the backdrop for his novels. His previous Robert Langdon novels include Angels and Demons, Inferno, and The Lost Symbol. His last major novel was Origin. His last book was the 2020 picture book Wild Symphony. It is a great pleasure to welcome Dan Brown to this week's book show. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for the rather incredible introduction. I've actually wanted to be on this show for a long time. I know you're a big book guy, and I'm a fan of your show, so thanks for having me.
I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Give me a sense of what the last 2 years has been like for you. You are a writer known for intensive, rigorous research and traveling to God knows where and back to get the story that you're looking for. So what has it been like to kind of have a tether on that for a while?
It's been a little bit frustrating, but also kind of exciting because in a few cases, with respect to the countries of Iceland and Italy, where I like to write, I actually was able to travel during COVID with a whole lot of protection and very safely, and was able to see some of these places totally deserted, which was exciting. But for the most part, like so many of us now, I do a lot of research online, which is not quite as easy. It's great to be in a space, especially if you're going to write about it and really taste the air and hear the sounds and all of that, which you don't get online. But I'm glad the tether is being lifted and we can get back out there and explore.
It just fascinates me because given the specificity of the work, if you're looking at an object of art or looking at a building, architecture, a statue, that you hone in on just the tiniest of detail. And when you can't see it, is it different?
Yes, absolutely different. And with the exception of Deception Point, which was written about the Milne ice shelf in the Arctic Circle, I have been to absolutely every location I've ever written about. I find that it's absolutely critical to be there because what happens is you invariably see things and hear things and meet people that you wouldn't meet or see or feel otherwise. And I remember I wrote the first draft of Origin, which is set in Barcelona, without having gone inside Sagrada Familia. I'd been there as a kid, but I hadn't been in while I was writing the book. And I went back long after the book was pretty much done and discovered a stairwell that I didn't know was there until I had visited the spot and realized, oh no, the villain has to die on these stairs. There's nothing else that can happen on these stairs. And I had to go back and change the plot and actually remove a character earlier than I thought because it was so perfect. And that's something that happens only when you show up in person.
And that's a fascinating space because it's not done. The history of it is bizarre. And it just seems like a perfect place for a Robert Langdon novel to take place in.
Well, what's so fun about traveling with Robert Langdon's eyes? You're trying to see the world through his lens, where most of us may not notice how absolutely bizarre it is that there's a snail crawling up the side of a Catholic cathedral. Langdon would definitely notice that. And so I have an obligation to notice that. And so as a tourist, I become much more engaged in what I'm looking at. So it's a real luxury to sort of try to imagine you're somebody else as you're looking at different locations.
I mentioned in the introduction about the interplay, your fascination with the interplay between science and religion. You look at that book, Origin, the whole idea of that novel is, where do we come from? Where are we going? Those are two very simple questions, but my God, are they complicated?
Yeah, I halfway through that book thought, why did I aim quite this high? It was, why can't I ask something simple like, where's the Holy Grail?
Right.
You're right. Those are really big questions, and because these books are so labor intensive, I try to choose topics that fascinate me personally, because I have to stay intellectually and emotionally involved in the topic for such a long time. And these are the questions that we've been asking literally since primordial, humans looked up at the stars and said, well, what's that? What's my place in that? Where did all that come from? And we're still asking them today in this age of AI and medical science, and we still don't have the answers. I just think it's fascinating.
When you take on something like that, and as you say, at some point you say, what was I thinking? It seems, though, that just reignites you, right? That is, okay, well, I'll show you that we can do this.
Yeah, and the challenge is always to create a thriller around this topic, such that there are plenty of books that are philosophy books that try to answer these questions, or at least frame them in a way that makes sense. The challenge is always, how do you write a book where people really want to turn the pages,
right,
and are learning on every page. And that's one reason these books take so long. And I'm almost done a new Robert Langdon thriller right now, and the challenge of this topic, which is sort of on the same par of just you just wonder why you chose it at some point. The challenge has been, how do you make this a thriller? So that really is what I feel my job is when I sit down for readers, is to say, look, let me weave a story around this topic such that you don't notice how much you're experiencing and learning and seeing along the way.
Bestselling author Dan Brown is our guest on this week's book show. You trust yourself, though, right? I've heard you talk about this. You have to have the trust in yourself that no matter what has been written about you, no matter what has been said, no matter what people think about your books, that you are able to make that a thriller, and to put Robert in the situation and get him out of it.
Sure. I do something very specific, and people either love it or they hate it. And at some point, you either say, like, I wish every single person loved my book. And you realize, well, that's just not the way creativity works.
Yeah.
And I don't care who you are. If you are a chef or a musician or a writer, all you have is your own taste. You have to create the souffle, the painting, or the novel that you think is good. And then you hope other people share your taste. And so I just have to step back from whatever critics or fans have to say and say, well, this is the book that I would want to read. And I just hope somebody out there shares my taste. And clearly not everybody will. And so you just let that go, and you trust yourself that you're really writing the book that you would want to read. That's it.
You spoke a moment ago about that it has to be a thriller. So when you have all of the ingredients in place, that it's a thriller. One of the things, and I regret that it probably took me much longer than it should have for me to realize that your books generally take place in a 24-hour period of time. It's something that I was, right, okay, that's something. And I was reminded of that when I was recently reading Origin again. That is something I assume you do to keep that level of suspense and propulsion going, so it never lets up, because it's not like you have to wait a month or a couple of weeks. It's what happens the next minute.
Sure. And that's absolutely true. All of these happen in 24 hours. The book I'm writing right now, I've actually turned up the volume, and I'm trying to do it in 12 hours with twice as many characters. So it's been a fun one to write. But what's funny about noticing the 24 hours, when Da Vinci Code came out, I got a call from Ron Howard and Brian Grazer saying, we want to buy this. We have this show that's coming out that takes place in 24 hours with this guy, Jack Bauer. And we think that maybe this book can be one of our seasons. And, it turned out that's not what we did, but Ron Howard was eventually involved. But it just it's funny that the first iteration of the Da Vinci Code could have been Jack Bauer running around Paris. It's just not many people know that.
When you look at the novels, as I mentioned, this is the fifth. You have 5 Robert Langdon novels. You're working on the sixth, and 2 novels before that. The first Robert Langdon novel, not a hit. Do you have any idea, and I assume you have to think about this, what happened between the first one and the second one, which, oh, by the way, happened to be the Da Vinci Code?
Yeah, I think the honest answer is good luck. I ended up with a publisher who published the book properly, and I never changed a single word in Angels and Demons, and it went on to become a #1 New York Times bestseller. And I still today have a lot of fan mail where people say, that's my favorite book. And so I don't think that there was anything different about the way I wrote. I think that just there was a timing issue of I switched publishers, and they really understood what I was trying to do. And they decided to, they told me the story of they handed out the first 100 pages of the manuscript to everybody at Doubleday, and they had a meeting, and everybody agreed they wanted to buy it. And Steve Rubin called me and said, that's never happened. Like, we've never had everybody decide we should buy it. So they bought it and really promoted it. And it also just by chance came out at a time when a lot of people were questioning the role of Catholicism in the world and some of the stories and politics that were going on. And I just think it was, it wasn't planned. It just happened.
Bestselling author Dan Brown is our guest on this week's book show. One of the fascinating things, the book is an instant bestseller. It's not like it's a slow build. It just takes off right out of the gate. The sales were huge prior to the book even being published. So you had some indication that you were sitting on a monster here, but obviously you could never anticipate what was to come.
No, I had turned in the manuscript and gone down, and I was living in this little rental in Costa Rica, outlining the lost symbol, my next book. In basically in the jungle, and had no internet. And every day would drive this Jeep down the side of a mountain into this tiny little town of Capos and go in this incredibly hot little closet at an internet cafe and pay whatever it was to get online. And every day my agent would send me an email saying like, hey, Border just upped their pre-order sales and Barnes & Noble just upped their, and finally she said, you got to call me. I called and she said, you got to come home because the pre-orders, this was a year before the book came out. The pre-orders are so big that Random House wants to put you on tour before the book comes out.
Meet the booksellers.
Yeah. Which was funny. And I remember Steve Rubin, who was the publisher at the time, say, look, they like your book. They just want to know you're not a jerk. That's your only job. Literally, just go meet all these people and just convince them you're not a jerk.
Seems like a simple test to pass.
Harder than it may seem, but it was fun, and it was in a different era when booksellers, especially independent booksellers, were absolutely critical to the process, and I miss it, and it's sad because those are all relationships and places that people like you who love books and people like your fans who love books could go and experience being in the presence of a lot of books. And we do so much of it online now, and it's a different experience.
You had a grace period from my recollection of it, of where everyone was looking at each other going, oh my God, how this book is outstanding, and it's going out every door of every bookstore in the country, to then there being the ultimate, what is often expected of the backlash, where people start to criticize not only the writing, but especially the content, and then you have a genuine controversy on your hands. Were you ready for that at all?
No. I grew up, as you said in the introduction, my dad was a math teacher. My mom was a sacred musician. Both educators. I grew up in a house where I was allowed to ask questions, and I was encouraged to ask questions. And so in my mind, the Da Vinci Code really asked a very simple question. What does it mean for Christianity if Jesus is not literally the Son of God, if he's a mortal prophet, somebody with a lot of beautiful ideas and beautiful teachings, but not the literal son of a deity. That was what the book asked. In a million years, I never imagined the pushback on that, especially because a lot of other people had written about it. A lot of other people. I mean, this is, the research was not done going through genetic evidence from 2,000 years ago. This was other research books that had been written over a century. And so, I was pretty surprised. And they were strange days, because certainly the controversy was intellectually stimulating, because I got a chance to, say what I thought and defend myself. But it was also upsetting, because a lot of it was very mean-spirited and it was less of a dialogue and more of a shouting match or a scolding. And that's just not how I grew up. I grew up on the campus of Phillips Exeter Academy, where, everything was about academia and asking questions and listening politely to other people's points of view, even if you think they're nuts. So, it was pretty surprising.
Dan Brown is the author of numerous #1 best-selling novels, including The Da Vinci Code, which has become one of the best-selling novels of all time. One of the things that I mentioned in the introduction is the last book that you have done as a picture book, Wild Symphony, which I would like to touch on, because what I found to be the most fascinating part of this, there's the work itself, which is really cool, but also the fact that this goes back to your earliest roots. If you were not to have become an author, you originally were trying to become a musician.
That is true. I mean, music was certainly my first love. My mom was a professional musician. My dad was a very good musician. I took piano lessons at a very young age. And when I was growing up, we had a record player. We had no radio. We had a record player, and my mom had a huge collection of classical records. And so that's the music that I heard, was classical music. And there was a point in my life when I didn't even know there was any music other than classical. I lived on the campus of a prep school. I was often taken to classical music concerts, and that's really all that was ever there. So some of my fondest memories were sitting and reading Dr. Seuss or Richard Scarry or some of these great picture books on the living room floor, listening to Tchaikovsky and thinking like, oh, I like this part where it's really loud and there are fireworks, or whatever it happens to be. So in creating Wild Symphony, really what I was trying to do was to recreate some of those childhood memories where I was looking at picture books, reading Dr. Seuss's poetry, or Ogden Nash, or Sendak, or any of these great writers, and listening to music simultaneously. I thought, how fun would it be to create a book where the music you're listening to is actually directly related to the book? And that's what I set out to do with that. And I have been to say I'm a composer is probably overstating it. I've been writing music since I was a little kid, and have never stopped. And I still play piano about an hour a day. I still write music, and set out to write a symphony that really is geared toward children. Classical music can be so intimidating, not just for kids, but for adults. We feel like we somehow need to know more about it to appreciate it. And so a lot of us just don't even try. And Wild Symphony, it's been out now 2 years, and there have been concerts all over the world. And I can't tell you how fun it is to be in some huge concert hall in Europe filled with families and have kids like in these elegant places dancing down the halls like bouncing kangaroos or happy hippopotamuses or whatever they're listening to. And this is their first experience with classical music. And for them, it's very positive, and it's very light, and in some cases funny and joyful. I'll be on stage reading these short poems that are immediately followed by these sort of bite-sized pieces of classical music, Happy Hippos or Brilliant Bat or Wondrous Whale. And these pieces conjure the image or the activity or the sounds of these animals. And invariably kids will get up and start running around having fun. And you say, like, this is a classical music concert? It's, how fun is this?
Dan Brown is our guest on this week's book show. His books include The Da Vinci Code and Origin. There was a time where popular fiction writers were moving to write a novel or two for children or for young adults. Was that something you ever considered?
It was, and I decided against it, mainly because I write slowly, and a lot of, whether you love it or hate it, a lot of what I do has to do with the point of view of a very thoughtful protagonist, someone who's thought a lot about religion, thought a lot about science and art and architecture. And generally, a younger mindset, I think I would have trouble writing it. There's not enough life experience to reflect in the ways that I would want to reflect. Maybe that's not true, but the reality is I don't have time to do everything. We're turning Wild Symphony into a movie right now with MGM, and I'm trying to write a new novel, and I just don't want to be spread too thin.
Tell me about the stage production of Da Vinci Code that was in London.
So, when I heard that a very reputable writer and producer wanted to turn Da Vinci Code into a stage play, my initial thought was, well, that's impossible.
Seems hard.
I'm like, what are you thinking? So they sent some test chapters of the script. And I thought, oh, it was a really interesting, very modern take. It was definitely the Da Vinci Code. It wasn't rewritten, but it was compressed and rendered in a very effective and dramatic way. And then you add on top of that all of the special effects that they used. It was a really great looking show. And unfortunately, due to COVID, it's on pause, but it's going to start back up. And I think it's going to be in Norway, Canada, and the US next year. I think that's what I heard. I can't remember, but it will have a life. I just don't. I think all of stage productions are sort of
right.
climbing out of the COVID dust.
You have been just, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I think you've been incredibly lucky having the productions of your work that you've had. Of course, Ron Howard and Tom Hanks, no slouches there, but taking your work and really giving a version of the story that you were telling, but still making a damn fine movie.
I learned so much being part of those movies, and I'm not the kind of guy who's going to tell Ron Howard or Tom Hanks how to do. Let me tell you how to do this. I'm sure I was a producer of some sort, and I know I had some sort of sway and clout. But the reality is, I felt like a tourist a little bit on the movie set. Occasionally they'd politely ask what I thought of something, but the reality is, those guys make movies. I write books, and what I learned along the way is how different those two processes are. I know you've talked to a lot of authors, and maybe they've drawn that comparison that when you're an author, you have an enormous toolbox. You have various points of view. You can get in the head of every character. You can flash back seamlessly. You can sort of fantasize about what's going to happen in the future, and you just have huge flexibility. And then you go and try to make a movie, and you say, like, wait a minute, I've got one point of view, the camera. That's it. That is my point of view. I can't see in people's heads. If Langdon's walking down the street and he's hungry, he can't have a passing thought, oh, I'm hungry. He has to, stop at a donut shop and look in longingly. It's really inefficient compared to writing novels. And I remember telling Ron Howard, I said, wow, I almost feel, he was just saying, God, I don't know how I'm going to turn this book into a movie. And I said, in watching this process, it's almost as if somebody's handed you a full color painting and said, do that, but I'm only going to give you a piece of charcoal. This is your tool. Good luck. I'm amazed that any movie gets made, much less good movies.
What's fascinating to me of how it affects the audience, at least for me, is that when I read the Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons, I made up what Robert Langdon looked like in my mind, and I painted that picture. Now, when I read Origin, I see Tom Hanks, and that's different, and that's okay, but it is different.
You're right. And that is one of the reasons I did not want to make movies. I thought, well, if I'm going to write a bunch of Langdon books, let me write them all, let them survive for a while, and then we'll make movies. And I think it really undermines the experience of reading to have movies out there. And I would always use the particle physics analogy that the wave collapses and all possibilities cease to exist except one, Tom Hanks. And I think for the reading experience, that's limiting. So it was kind of funny because when I said I didn't want to make Da Vinci Code, I meant it. I had no intention of making it. And I got a fax. This is a fax at home. This is back when we had faxes. This is early 2000s. I got a fax from a very well-known producer who basically wrote me this love letter. I don't know how he got my home fax number, but he just said, listen, Da Vinci Code is a touchstone of human culture. There are people who don't read. It's like your duty to humanity to make this into a movie. And by the time I finished reading this, I was like, he's right. For the good of mankind, I need to make this movie. Yeah. So yeah, he appealed to my ego very, very effectively. In the end, I did not work with him. Ended up making it with Sony Pictures and Ron Howard. But it was just sort of funny that my instinct was overridden pretty quickly by convincing me it was an important contribution to humanity, which of course is silly.
Dan Brown, an absolute pleasure to speak to you. I thank you so much for being with us and taking the time to talk about your amazing career. It's a great pleasure to have had you on the program.
The pleasure's mine, Joe, and thanks for everything that you do for books. Appreciate it.
For this episode, we thank the Wit Festival and the Authors Guild Foundation with their mission to educate, support, and protect American writers, authorsguild.org. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for